And I don't know if you all know each other, but I'll go ahead and have everybody introduce themselves just so everybody knows who's on the Zoom today. So you want to start, Susan?
Sure. I'm Susan Hawksworth. I'm the director at the Smoky Hill Museum.
Very good. Janet?
Sorry, I was muted.
That's okay.
My name's Janet Wade. I live in Harrington and am on the Convention Visitors Bureau and work with a volunteer organization.
Okay, very good. Good to have you today. Janelle, you want to introduce yourself and tell who you're with?
Hello. Sorry, I was answering a question.
No worries.
What were you saying?
Oh, I was just asking for you to introduce yourself, tell who you are and who you're with.
Okay, sure. Janelle Heimer, I'm a community outreach supervisor at Salina Family Healthcare.
Okay, very good. Well, my name is Cindy Miles. I know it says Kansas Nonprofit Chamber up here, but I am the president and CEO of the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber. I've been doing consulting and board development and other things with nonprofits for many years. And I love the work that I do. I'm very passionate about nonprofit organizations. And I'm a certified consultant through an organization called BoardSource, if you're familiar with BoardSource. That's where I received my training to do this work at. So with that, we will get started. I'm going to share my screen. Everybody see that? Oh, I need to make it bigger. Let's see if I can do. Let's try this. Okay, can everybody see? Oh, I'm not at the beginning, but can everybody see that? Okay. Yes?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was a little bit worried that maybe you couldn't hear me anymore. As I was saying earlier, I'm on my Chromebook this morning because my computer is acting up, and the Chromebook doesn't operate quite the same way as the computer, so it makes me a little bit nervous, but so we'll get started. I love talking about committees because committee structure is one of the things that it seems nonprofits struggle with. So I like to help them kind of figure out how they can create those effective and functioning committees. So let's talk a little bit about the whole structure of the board, committees, all that kind of things. It really, having that structure in place is really important for nonprofit organizations. And I know I visit with a lot of nonprofit organizations that have boards that are, maybe consist of 3 or 4 or 5 people. And it's really hard to make a nonprofit successful with that few of board members. So having structure is very important to the organization. And of course, you can see there that lack of structure leads to really an organization not operating effectively. Maybe the meetings are not really focused well. You're not talking about the topics that you need to be talking about at a board meeting. There can be lots of dysfunction as a result of that lack of structure. I know I've had I'm not sure if I could say opportunity, but I have had the opportunity to work with a few boards over the years that had a lot of dysfunction, and maybe they had a board chair that had served for 20 years as the board chair and had kind of taken control of the organization, which is not good for an organization. And then last but not least, regarding board structure, I mean, there's not one size fits all answer for all boards. It really kind of varies from board to board as far as, the size of the board, what the programs and services the organization is offering. So there are a lot of variables, but there are some general things regarding board structure that organization should look at. And I want you all to know that if you have any questions or thoughts, please stop me. I don't mind for you to stop and ask questions because I certainly want to be engaging. So right size your board, make it sure that when you're creating your board overall, that it is the right size. And, you know, I had an organization that was on a Zoom call with me, I don't know, maybe a few months ago, and way that they structured their board was that the requirements in their bylaws were that the people that served on the board could only be from that particular city, the town, actually small town, a very small town. They could only be from that particular town. And it was restricting, because that was a small town, it was restricting the capacity of them to have not only board members that had rotating terms, but really to get board members at all that hadn't previously been engaged, or getting new board members. Yet what they did was they served people not just in that town, but really farther out in the county. So one of the things that they could have done in order to really help their board was to change their bylaws so they could allow people outside of that town, other people that are being served in other areas, to participate. But it's, you know, it's really important to decide what's going to be great for your organization. It is difficult to effectively discuss important issues and make decisions as a big group. So if you've got a board, and I'm sure that none of you do, but I've worked with and seen, if you've got a board of 60 people, and we have some organizations in Wichita that do, it's really hard to make decisions with a group that big. And it's really hard to even get that many people to a board meeting. So again, right size is really important. And then a board that's too big might have an executive committee that's too powerful and functioning as a governing board. So you don't want to have an executive committee, and it's not their role, not the role of an executive committee, to make decisions for the board as a whole. And I know I sat in a board meeting yesterday where there was discussion about making certain spending decisions that just required the board chair or the treasurer's approval. And I was like, no, that's not appropriate, because if they're going to make decisions about spending $25,000 or $50,000, the board as a whole needs to make that decision. I've got to stop sharing a second. I got to let somebody in. Sorry about that. Uh-oh. Hold on. Oh my goodness. Oh, here we go. Got to let Patricia in. Patricia, did we get you in here? There she is. Give me a second. I got to get back to my PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. Just isn't as easy on a Chromebook. All right. So just a little bit of discussion about that board that's too small, which I kind of went into with the board that was too big as well. If you've got too small of a board, you may not have enough external perspectives. And I teach a lot about boards and having a diversity of skills, strengths, and experience. That's one of the things that's really hard to create when you have a board that's too small. And certainly I work with organizations that want to have 3 board members, and they ask me, you know, can you create a successful organization with 3 board members? And I've never seen that happen. Also, it doesn't enable the organization to reach important networks. So you've got to be doing advocacy, fundraising, and collaboration. And then there's that inability to provide effective oversight if your board is too small. And back to that, somebody, wielding too much power, that can certainly happen when your board is too small. So I always tell people, and going back to the board meeting that I sat at yesterday, this is all I could think about, was that committees are where the work happens. So if you bring together a board meeting and you're talking about a lot of little details regarding what's going on with the organization, you probably don't have a good committee structure to be working out some of those details that then should be brought to the board as a whole to approve. So when you have committees, the work happens so much more effectively. It is really a great way to structure and manage the board's work as a whole. And then sometimes a smaller group can be more focused on dealing with specific things. So if you, for instance, you tried to plan an event, a fundraising event at a board meeting, that's going to be a challenge to do. It's better to have a committee that can actually work on that and then bring those ideas or recommendations or questions back to the board, but work as a committee to actually make that thing happen, because those are not the things you should be discussing at your board meeting. And so it's important to have those smaller groups that can do that work. Does everybody have committees?
Yes,
Yes. Functioning?
somewhat.
Okay. Okay. I
would
hear that often.
I would say the Salina family has good functioning committees.
Oh, good. That's good. I work with a lot of nonprofits that say, well, we kind of have committees. They don't really meet and they don't really do anything, or they don't meet regularly, or I hear lots of different stories, and it's kind of interesting, but it does seem to be sometimes a real struggle. So rules about developing committees. Number one, just because it's important doesn't mean you need a committee for it. I happen to be working with an organization that I'm trying to help redirect. And when I got involved with that organization, they had 6 board members and about 13 committees. And so they had created a committee for every little thing that they did. I was amazed at the committees that they had. And it's probably no surprise to you, as it was no surprise to me, that none of those were good functioning committees, because they only had 6 people on their board and they weren't engaging anybody from the outside. And you can't possibly have 6 board members run that many committees. I mean, they would be meeting all the time in order to do that. And we have to be respectful of those board members' time that they have to commit. So certainly you want a commitment from them, but overcommitment causes them to be burnt out and step away. I've seen that a lot as well. So you should really kind of identify when, what standing committees are going to be best for your organization. Make sure that there's a true need for that. And I'm going to talk here in a few minutes about what some of the most basic committees are that organizations should look at forming. Every committee should have something defining the role of the committee, so every member of that committee understands what is expected of them, what is expected of the committee, as well as they have some sort of direction for what that committee is supposed to be doing. That's another terrible thing, is to create a committee and say you're the development committee, but not give them any idea really of what exactly you expect from that. Is that fundraising events? Is that going out and making ask? Do you expect them to grant write? What is it exactly that they need to be doing? And that needs to be defined well. So the best model is to have one of the board members chair a committee, so they can act as a liaison between the committee and the board, but to invite people that aren't on the board to actually serve on the committee. And that allows a pipeline for future board members for one, but it also allows your committees to be bigger than what they would be if you, for instance, just had 6 or 8 board members and you had 5 committees, and you need to figure out how all those committees were going to have sufficient enough people to get the work done. So it's always a good practice to invite people who aren't on the board to participate in those committees. And it's also a way to get potential donors engaged or other people in the community engaged with the organization one way or the other. Everybody do that? Yes?
I don't honestly know about
Okay.
Salina Families Board and if they have
Committees?
non-board members on their
Okay.
committees. I was just thinking in the organization itself, we have a lot of committees that are run by employees, but
Yeah, yeah.
from a board
Yeah.
standpoint, I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's kind of interesting, to look at all the different people that we could potentially engage in our organizations if we invited those non-board members. And it's also interesting to look at those organizations that I've worked with that are trying to run all those committees with 10 or 12 board members, and they have 5 committees and everybody's stressed out and everything, and they don't consider inviting outside people, but it really is a great practice to do that.
Hello.
Hello?
Well, I'm Patricia. I'm from the Salvation Army. So now we are celebrating 125 years. So, and we are having good experience with a committee that we have now. So we are inviting people from the community and all that one. So I had like 3 or 4 members that are now from my board. So that's very good experience that we're having right now.
That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fantastic that you're celebrating 125 years as well. That's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah.
Yeah, good job. So a little bit about the role of the committee. Really, committees are not only doing that work, but they are providing counseling and advice for the board. They're making recommendations to the board. They might be looking into something a bit deeper. I know that we here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, we created not a committee, but this kind of committee. We called it a task force, and I'll talk about those later because it was focused on shorter goals. It wasn't something that needed to go on forever and ever, but we opened up a building that we call the 501c Foundry, where we house small nonprofit organizations to help them grow their organizations. So we're incubating them. And certainly having some people on that task force from the board was great. Having a few external members from people out in the community that had an idea about what we should provide for nonprofit organizations as we're opening that was great to have that external advice and input from other people. So the role of the committee is also to handle a task on the board's agenda. So all those things that come out of board meetings, those action items that might come out of a board meeting are great to be passed off to a particular committee and allow them to do that. And as a matter of fact, when I do strategic planning with organizations, I like for them to have a good committee structure so that I can ultimately, as we define goals for that organization, assign each goal from that strategic plan to a particular committee, because they almost always fall into line with what a committee is doing. So if one of the goals of a strategic plan ends up being that they want to increase funding by $100,000, well, naturally that would fall under the development committee, right? So it just seems to fall naturally. So that's the way when I do strategic planning, I like to be able to challenge each committee with having a goal that they can actually work on during the year, 2 years, or 3 years, whatever that term is for that strategic plan. So I do want to let people know that recommendations made by the committee need to be approved by the board. So committees can come up with all types of recommendations, but they aren't a decision-making structure. So let's say the finance committee was getting together and they made the decision, or they thought that the organizations should spend $25,000 on some new software, and they just made that decision and went out and purchased the software. Well, they really don't have the authority to do that. That's beyond what their authority is. That really would need to be a board decision as a whole. So they would make that recommendation to the board, but the board would then need to create approval. That's not to say if, you know, the development committee is, or an event committee is working on an event and they decide they want to use the colors of red and blue for the event, that's not something that needs to be approved by the board. But other recommendations that are really going to have a huge effect on the organization in some way, those really need to be approved by the board as a whole. So the committee's not necessarily a decision-making committee. And of course, committees are more effective when they have their work clearly defined. So that's another reason why it's really important to make sure that you have some sort of a charter or something that outlines what their roles and responsibilities are. So here is the most common, the most traditional committee structure here. That generally will consist of the executive committee. And I think I'm going to go more into what the executive committee should look like. The finance committee, the governance committee. Does everybody have a governance committee? No, maybe. Some have nominating committees, although I'll talk to you about how that really should fold into the governance committee. And then the fundraising or development committee. So those are the most common. If you were to survey nonprofit organizations out there, these are the ones that would come up at top. You can also form ad hoc committees, advisory committees, or task force, just as I discussed with you when we were opening the 501c Foundry. We created a task force because it wasn't something that we were going to be doing well, that we needed input on forever. It was just something that we needed to have some input in for a while, and some things that we needed to figure out. We did the same thing when we decided to launch a fiscal sponsorship, to act as a fiscal sponsor for people who weren't nonprofit organizations but wanted to kind of act as nonprofit organizations. So we figured out what that should look like, what the MOU should look like, and all that work. And then we disbanded that task force because it wasn't something that was going to be an ongoing need. Then the other thing is every board should have a committee focused on financial oversight and one focused on governance. And governance is one of the big committees that I am surprised at how often, or not how often, I guess, that organizations don't have a governance committee. Sometimes they'll develop a nominating committee, but they won't develop a governance committee. And governance is one of the most important things that your board does. So let's talk a little bit more about these. Again, the qualities of effective committees, making sure that they have a clear job description and defined goals. And I mentioned that earlier when talking about the strategic planning. Making sure that they have a chair who will actually involve all members in the committee work, and not only involve them, but stay on top of whether or not they're completing the things that they need to complete, the tasks, the action items, those types of things that need to be done by the committee. Committee members need to be willing to take the time to accomplish the tasks that they've been given. I don't know how, if any of you have experienced coming to a board meeting or coming to a committee meeting, and everybody or somebody or a few people or whatever had some action item that they were supposed to take care of, and you're checking back in, you're going through action items to see what's been completed, and then you have a member that was supposed to complete something and they're like, oh, I didn't get around to doing that. And at the next meeting, they say, oh, I didn't get around to doing that. I'll get that done. But that goes on and on and on, and it keeps the committee from actually achieving the things that they need to achieve. So you've got to have members of that committee that are willing to actually do the things that they're being tasked with doing. In order to have effective committees, they need to understand the time constraints and deadlines for whatever it is that they're working on, whatever that committee is taking on. And again, I just want to reiterate that understanding it, that it does not make decisions. So it advises, recommends, or carries out a task. And they have some sort of evaluation process to assess whether or not they're achieving what they want to achieve. So maybe that process is they set up some sort of measurements. For instance, the fundraising or the development committee, you know, if they had a goal of raising $100,000, they'd want to know how they're going to raise that $100,000. And then they want to be able to measure what their progress is towards that $100,000 over the year. And maybe they've, you know, have created a fundraising plan that says they're going to try to get $25,000 in grants and $10,000 from individual donors and $20,000 from major donors. And they're going to have a fundraising event that's going to raise another $20,000. So whatever that is, if they break that down, then that allows them to measure whether or not they're actually achieving what they need to be achieving throughout the year. There is what's called a zero-based committee structure that some nonprofit organizations work with, which means at the beginning of every year, that they start with no committees, and they looked at what work they're going to do throughout the year, and they evaluate and they build committees based on what they hope to achieve that year. I guess that keeps committees from maybe becoming stagnant and going throughout a year and not really working on anything. That does allow some of those committees, and going back to that organization that I was working with that has those 12 or 13 committees, or did have, they no longer do have, they now have 5, that 12 or 13 committees, then, you know, that it kind of allows you to look at what's unnecessary and dissolve those committees. It does mean that maybe the chair changes often, so there's more leadership opportunities for the board members to step up and be chair of a committee. And those leadership changes are not threatening. Now, I don't know that I'm crazy about a zero-based committee structure, but it is a model that your organization could follow and redo everything every year. I think there's always some basic committees, like the finance committee or the development committee or the governance committee, that you're always going to have a need for. And there's always things that can be addressed, that's ongoing things. But certainly a zero-based committee structure is an option. Does anybody use a zero-based committee structure? I'm just curious. Nope. Can you all still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure nothing technical had gone wrong. There are organizations that work with absolutely no committees. I've seen that. Sometimes that's pretty common with small startup organizations that aren't doing a lot of work. Sometimes it's with bigger organizations that has a lot of staff, and they don't really require a big committee structure, any committee structure, to get the work done of the organization. Certainly, you know, here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, we're a group of 6. So it's important for our board to have committees that can help us do some of the work, whether it's solicit sponsorships or review bylaws or those types of things. But but there is that option to not have any committee structure. I just think if you're at a certain size, if the organization is at a certain size, if it's a really small organization, startup organization, kind of depending on where you're at with your life and your life cycle of your organization and how many employees you have. I think that committee structure is important, but again, you might not have that depending on those different variables. Board members do manage the workload together in those organizations that don't have a committee structure. And then they just delegate tasks to individual board members. And then it does require really effective leadership and commitment from every member to operate an organization with absolutely no committees. I hear from those organizations that don't have committees, or they don't have effective functioning committees, that they often struggle with getting the work done that needs to be done, that's focused on particular areas like fundraising or maybe programs and services. It really kind of depends on what their work that they're doing, but certainly it's an option to operate with no committees. So there should be a limited number of standing committees. And again, going back to that organization that had 12 or 13 committees, that's too much. You really need to figure out what's the right number of committees that your organization can handle, that you can fill effectively, and that make sure that they're doing important work, and that they have goals that they're going to accomplish. So there's just certain things about creating committees that it's important to kind of be simple, keep it flexible. When you write your bylaws, and I read a lot of bylaws, I'm studying some bylaws right now. I'm going over some bylaws for somebody that they're very interesting. But you keep the committee structure out of the bylaws, because you can get way too detailed in your bylaws. And it's great to have a committee structure, but you can outline in your bylaws that the board has the right to create committees based on what's needed for the organization. But you'll find if you put all that committee structure, like if you list, well, we're going to have a fundraising committee and a governance committee and all these different committees, that every time you want to change that, then you have to go back and change your bylaws. So it's easier just to say that in your bylaws that the board can establish committees as needed, and maybe write some words around that, or some rules or whatever around what that process looks like to create those committees. With the exception of the executive committee, there should be something written about the executive committee in your bylaws. And then I think I've already mentioned that it's great to give each group some sort of an objective or goal that the full board agrees on. So whether that's raising $100,000 more, whether that's creating a succession plan, which is something generally a governance committee would work on, whatever that is, that it's always important that they have some sort of goal that they're working towards. And then kind of figuring out some ground rules and determine how the communication will work between the board and the committees, how they will report back to the board, how they will have conversations with the board. Is that stuff that they're communicating? Does it just go in a report? Are they actually going to do a verbal report at a board meeting to educate the board on what's going on? Are they just going to bring up at the board meeting the things that they need board feedback about or board decisions about? So it's really kind of important to identify what that looks like. So who should serve where on committees? Well, it's always best to kind of align what board member skills, strengths, and experience are with the committee that they're going to serve on. So you know, it's always important to have somebody that knows about finances on the finance committee, right? And of course, the finance committee is generally chaired by the treasurer. But you also want to make sure that, you know, you've got other people that are matched up with their skills. If, you know, fundraising is their strength, then they should probably be on the development committee. If grant writing is their strength, they should probably be on the development committee. But you need to make sure that that just reflects with what their strengths are. The other thing, though, that you need to think about is sometime it's good to give that person that has a financial background exposure to the fundraising committee, or have them participate on a fundraising committee if they so choose, so they can learn more about fundraising. The boards are a great way for people to gain additional skills. So giving them an opportunity to sometimes serve on a different committee is a great idea as well. Here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, at the beginning of every year, we have our standing committees, but we allow our board members to switch to another committee if they so choose to switch to another committee, because we want them to learn the different aspects of what the different committees are doing. But we don't force them to do that, but we give them a choice. Your committee should reflect the diversity of your board. And I already talked about rotating around. So there is no actually like ideal committee size. The committee size really should be big enough that you can achieve the goals of that committee. You can achieve whatever strategies and stuff that they've set forth. That's really what determines the optimal size of the committee. It does, you know, it does need to be small enough to keep all the members engaged, involved, making sure that they all have something that they can do that's doable for them. And then the group dynamics can determine the effective working relationships and consequently the size of the group. So you might have a larger committee that has a larger amount of work to do, but you split the work up in smaller pieces. You might have a small group that is okay with taking on the same amount of work but doing more work. So a lot of that committee size also is going to be dependent on how much time each committee member has. I know I talk a lot about nonprofit boards and having a combination of wisdom, worker bees, and wealth on nonprofit boards. And so those worker bees are always going to take on more work potentially than what those who have wealth or have access to wealth, and maybe even those that have the wisdom about what you're doing. So you've got to always have those worker bees and make sure they're distributed amongst your committees as well. If you have a committee that has no worker bees, you're in trouble. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the governance committee. Okay, I've got to ask, or did I already ask if anybody has a governance committee?
I do not know. First line of family.
Okay.
We do
You have
not.
First Line of Family has a lot of internal employee committees, right?
Yes.
Okay. Somebody else was speaking up. Do you have a governance committee?
We do not at the Friends of the Smoky Hill Museum.
Okay, thank you. So I will continue to say, I can't tell you how important a governance committee is. And most organizations, a lot of organizations that I've worked with, they've never really even thought about having a governance committee. And they think really, you know, if we had a governance committee, all of their role is to look at the bylaws. So they need to review their, you know, the organization's bylaws every few years. Maybe they have a nominating committee that looks at how do they recruit board members? How do they onboard board members? Well, that's another role that the governance committee can take on. So the governance committee really, they kind of oversee these three areas that are mentioned here. So the board recruitment on an ongoing basis. So not just board recruitment right before you're going to have elections, but the governance committee would on an ongoing basis work on kind of identifying and developing a pool of people that can potentially serve on the board. So that's something that should be, that succession planning for who's going to be on your board. Board succession planning is something that should be going on an ongoing basis. It shouldn't be something that you just decide the month before elections and people are rolling off who might be good for the board. So that's one of the roles of the governance committee. Also making sure that the board is engaged, the board members are engaged, and they might do that by making sure that there's an orientation that happens every time you bring new board members on. So your new board member orientation, they might do that by creating a program where those new board members have a board buddy that kind of helps them through with questions and learning about the organization and those kinds of things. And then intentional revitalization. So keeping the board revitalized on an ongoing basis. And there's other things that the governance committee is responsible for doing. Looking at succession planning. Let me go back. Looking at succession planning, the bylaws I already mentioned, policies and procedures. And I have a great kind of an annual calendar for what a governance committee could focus on doing. And I would love to send that out to you all and just give you an idea of how, if you have a governance committee in place, or you put a governance committee in place, what they can be focused on from month to month to month. So it's more than just reviewing the bylaws. It's more than just board recruitment for the governance committee. If you bring that nominating committee in under the governance committee, you'll find that there's quite a bit that really impacts the organization that the governance committee can work on. Any questions about that? So when you look at building a governance committee, here's some of the qualifications that are great to have on a governance committee. And I should probably add to this list somebody that likes to read bylaws. No, bylaws they're interesting things, but it is good to have somebody that, you know, is very detail oriented and might have somebody on your governance committee that's got some HR experience. You might have somebody that has some legal experience if you've got somebody like that on your board. Trying to think of other good different backgrounds, but having that diverse range of backgrounds and experiences overall is good. Maybe if they have a wide range of board experience from different boards and or leadership experience within boards, that's always good to have somebody like that on your governance committee. It's good to have somebody that's active in the community and has a lot of connections on your governance committee. Certainly understanding the human dynamics and relationships that occur on a board, and not only on a board, but understanding kind of what the roles are between staff and the board and the CEO and the board or the board chair. That's important to understand on the governance committee. Maybe somebody that has experience with organizational development. Certainly having somebody that has knowledge of good governance practices. And if they don't, there's lots of resources out there. Certainly we have resources here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber on good governance practices. And it's important to have somebody that's willing to question what's being done and is willing to look at whether or not change needs to be incorporated into the organization, because we all know that just because you've always done something a certain way doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right way, or you should continue doing that way. You do need to have somebody that, or people that can really put the best interest of the organization first, because it's not about them. It's about, you know, the organization and building the best organization that you can. And then having experience in group performance evaluation, because the governance committee really should lead any kind of initiatives to do the CEO or executive director evaluation, as well as an assessment of the board and how the board is functioning. The governance committee would take on that role as well. So if you have somebody that's familiar with doing that, or doing some sort of a performance evaluations, then that's a great skill to add to your governance committee as well. Any questions about the governance committee?
No,
Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about the development committee. So the development committee, they work with the board chair, the chief executive, and the development staff, if there's development staff on staff. So some small organizations don't have a, you know, particular development director or maybe any kind of development staff whatsoever. But the point here is that they all have to work together. That it's not the development committee's role to go out and develop like a fundraising plan and then tell the chief executive, okay, now go make this happen. They really need to look at how to engage the entire board in that development plan and in fundraising, because it is a board's role, the whole board, everybody on the board, it is their role to be involved in fundraising. It doesn't just fall on the staff. It doesn't just fall on the board chair. It doesn't just fall on the chief executive. Everybody's role is to fundraise. And I know that's a hard concept for some boards to get on board with, but there's lots of ways that boards can get involved with fundraising, and the development committee needs to figure out how to engage them in that. So your development member qualifications, you should look for members who certainly can communicate effectively and be excited about the organization's mission, be able to communicate that organization's mission and what they actually do, and not just the mission. It's really important to be able to communicate about the programs and the services and whatever else that organization is offering, those types of things, as well as who they serve. That's important for them to be able to communicate. Development committee member qualifications, they should know about the organization and its community and its constituents. So that's, you know, who the organization is serving, what communities they're serving. Some organizations will, you know, serve a certain geographic area, and for some that's bigger, for some that's smaller. You know, we serve the entire state of Kansas. Some other organization might just serve Harper County, for instance. So it's good for the development committee members to know who their, you know, who the organization actually is serving and what communities. It's also good for them to have community connections and networks, because that's one of the important aspects, most important aspects of fundraising and development, is having those connections, knowing who has the capacity to give, knowing where to find funds. It's certainly important for them to have good people skills and be able to have conversations with people, be able to engage different people, be able to get them excited about the organization as well. They've got to be able to be comfortable talking about money and finances with others. Now, everybody on the development committee, though, doesn't have to be responsible for making an ask for money, though. There's lots of different ways that people can get involved in fundraising. They can help develop the fundraising plan. They can do donor appreciation by writing thank you notes. They can certainly make phone calls. They can make introductions to people who have the ability to give. So there's lots of different ways that they can get involved in fundraising, but certainly they've got to be comfortable on some level about talking about the money and finances of the organization with others. They need to have access to those individual, corporate, or foundation resources. So building those relationships with those organizations certainly is important, and doing so to the point where they're not concerned about reaching out to those organizations or those individuals. And they've got to have confidence and trust. And it's really important to have people in your development committee that have fundraising, grant writing, and or marketing experience, because all those are important to doing development for an organization. Any questions? Everybody have a finance committee? Nope.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's good to know. Finance committee also falls to the top of importance of committees to have. So the core functions of your finance committee are really to kind of oversee the financial planning for the organization. And that includes helping the organization to put together a budget, an annual budget, and taking that to the board, explaining that to the board, so they can get approval of that. But they've got to be involved in that organizational financial planning. It's certainly important for them to monitor and make sure that there's always adequate funds for the organization, that you've got cash flow coming in, you can pay the bills. And if not, to try to communicate that to the board and work within the finance committee to figure out what it is that needs to be fixed, or what it is that needs to be changed, or should they challenge the development committee to bring in more money? Is there other revenue that the organization can produce by doing some different things or adding some different programs or whatever that is? It is their role to make sure that the organizational assets are protected and that there's policies in place to make sure that those organizational assets are protected. And again, going back to the board meeting that I was at yesterday, where we were having a discussion over a financial policy, one of the fiscal policies in regards to spending, it was important to have a policy in place that says the executive director can't go out and spend over a certain amount of money without the approval of not just the board chair and the treasurer, but with the board as a whole. So it's good to have those policies in place. I have seen several organizations that an executive director or somebody else within an organization has been in trouble for embezzlement because they just didn't have the right policies in place, or they didn't, have policies that aligned with GAAP principles, and it opened the door for embezzlement to happen. And it's been, everybody that I know that's happened with has been somebody that I would have trusted and was shocked by. And regarding those fiscal policies, I want to mention to you, as that finance committee develops fiscal policies, it's really important that fiscal policies are designed around the position and the organization, and not around an individual person. Because you might have an executive director that's been with an organization for 15 years and everybody trusts them, but you're not developing policies to that person. That person eventually is going to leave. You're developing policies to the position. Does that make sense? Okay, so anticipating financial problems, that's certainly one of the core functions of the finance committee. Making sure that the board receives reports every month, that the whole board receives those, and is able to review the financial reports of the organization, and that they understand how to accurately read those financial statements, so that the board understands what it is they're reading, and they understand what they need to be looking for, and what they need to be asking questions about, because not everybody has an accounting background, or you get those financial statements and they can be kind of overwhelming because there's so much information on there and you don't really understand. Not everybody really understands how to read all that information. So the finance committee really should help the board understand what they should be looking for and what questions they should ask. And then ultimately making sure that the federal, state, and local reporting occurs. And I see nonprofit organizations way too often that get in touch with me, and they've either not filed a state report, a state annual report, they've not filed their 990s, or they've done something and they're just going along operating, and they have lost their nonprofit status, or they've lost their incorporation with the state and they don't even know it. And I tell a story sometimes about a Baptist church that contacted me, a First Free Will Baptist church that contacted me because they were having some issues within their organization. And when I went to go look up and see what their status was, their nonprofit status, I found hundreds of First Free Will Baptist churches that had lost their nonprofit status. And I'm betting that most of them had no idea, because they didn't file either their federal, or either they didn't file 990s, or they didn't file that articles of incorporation, that annual report with the state of Kansas. So ultimately the finance committee should be making sure that this stuff is done. And some just don't know. Are all you all good and up to date on your nonprofit status? Please tell me yes.
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 Is anybody unsure? Okay, that's good. The finance committee also provides oversight by reviewing those financial statements and making sure that everything's reflected in the budget, making sure the strategic priorities are reflected in the budget. So they're providing that oversight on an ongoing basis. And then the finance committee should be always asking the following questions: whether or not the organization's on track with the budget, whether they're achieving the revenue that they need to be achieving or that they budgeted for. And if not, what's going wrong? Why is it that the organization maybe isn't on track? And I can tell you, the finance committees were really thrown off in the past couple of years with COVID and everything that impacted, because I think that threw a lot of nonprofit organizations off. So here's some great qualifications for finance members, finance committee members to have. Certainly budgeting, if they've got experience doing that, accounting, real estate, if they're familiar with financial investments, if they've operated a business, or if they've operated a nonprofit as well and been involved in the financial part of that. If they've got a background in banking, those are all different skills and strengths that you could certainly look at when adding members to the finance committee. So financial background, important for every board. So your executive committee generally consists of your chair, your vice chair, your secretary, and your treasurer. Sometimes it also consists of, if you have a role with your board, for the past chair, because some organizations do. And I am seeing some organizations that also invite to participate in their executive committee, their committee chairs. So that really, depends on how you want to put together that executive committee. But those are the models that are pretty common, depending on how you want to put your executive committee together. its overarching role is to help the board do its work in the most efficient way. So they are not a decision-making authority. The executive committee doesn't have the right to make decisions on behalf of the board, but they can come together. They can talk about issues within the organization. They can brainstorm on recommendations to fix some of those issues. They can brainstorm on recommendations that they want to make to the board as a whole, things they want the board to consider. They can provide some direction for the board on things that need to be addressed, but they're not a decision-making authority, so they don't make decisions on behalf of the board. The duties can vary considerably from board to board, and again, largely depend on how the board is structured. They, again, should be addressed in the organization's bylaws. So I'm sure you remember when I mentioned to you the fact that you didn't need to outline every committee, but certainly outlining in the bylaws the role of the executive committee is important. And then there's that word of caution, which I've already mentioned, that the executive committee is not supposed to take over the board decision making. Sometimes I work with organizations where the executive committee has taken that on themselves to make decisions on behalf of the board, and maybe the board doesn't realize that the executive committee doesn't really have the authority to do that. Just a reminder that when you have a board of directors for a nonprofit organization, they are legally and financially responsible for the organization, which is why the whole board needs to be involved in making those major decisions. You don't want to turn that over to just a small group of people, because what they decide could impact all the rest of the board members. So here's some of the qualifications of those executive committee members. So as I already said, it generally includes the board chair, vice chair, other officers, and the chief executive, and sometimes an ex officio member, which can be that past chair. You'll notice that I refer to board officers as the chair and the vice chair, as opposed to the president and the vice president, just a best practice, because it limits some of the confusion with a board on or with an organization overall, because sometimes you have instead of an executive director, you have president and CEO of the organization. And then sometimes you have, the board president, the board vice president. It can just be confusing externally. So I always use the term chair, vice chair, as opposed to president. Committee chairs may also sit on the executive committee. I already mentioned that. In general, the executive committee members, they need to be people that are respected by the board. And honestly, if they're serving in officer roles for the board anyways, they should be respected by the whole board. The people that serve in your officer roles for your board should be people that can motivate the rest of the board, can get them engaged, that can communicate well, those types of things as well. They need to know the organization well, certainly the ins and outs, the programs and services. They need to be in it for the organization in itself and not have their own personal agendas, because everybody that serves on the board should be doing what's in the best interest of the organization and not themselves anyways. And of course, you need to have a diverse range of backgrounds and a variety of experience on your executive committee as well. All right, we're going to go through a little quiz. So if you've got a piece of paper and a pen, I'm going to read these questions to you, and I'm going to let you answer yes or no, and then we'll kind of review where you're at once we've gone through this. This kind of helps assess, are your committees working well? So whatever committees you have. So do your board members feel their participation in committees provides them with a way to contribute to the board's work and use their expertise that regular meetings do not? Yes or no? Okay, question number 2. Are committee assignments distributed evenly across the board so that every member has a chance to be involved in committee work? Question 3, do your board committees foster rather than hinder board staff interaction and cooperation and deepen the board's understanding of the issues that have an impact on the life of your organization? Yes or no? Do all of your work groups have an objective and a lifespan? Yes or no? Are any of your board members confused about your committee's roles? Number 6, are any of your committees duplicating another committee's work or the staff's work? Number 7, has a standing committee that had important work to do in the past now completed its objective and taken on work that may not have been sanctioned by the board to occupy its time? Number 8, does your board have so many committees that your board members are being stretched thin and having to attend too many meetings? Number 9, are there committees that are too large or too small to be effective? So they're not getting that work done. Number 10, are there standing committees that could be turned into task force with a specific objective to be accomplished within a specific time frame? Number 11, are your board committees focused on policy and strategic work, or are they involved in operations, which is usually the staff's responsibility? Number 12, if you have an executive committee, are all board members comfortable with the role it's playing? Does anyone feel the committee is acting in place of the board? So that's kind of 2 questions. Everybody got their answers? What do you think? How did you do? Did you get yes to most of these? No to most of these? Maybe there's some work to be done?
I am not in a role at Salina Family to know the answer to
Yeah.
almost any of those questions.
Okay. But you've got internal committee structures, right?
Yes, as far as our employee-led committees,
So they
seem very healthy.
When I send this PowerPoint presentation, you can review those and see how they apply to those committees as well. How about the rest of you? How are your committees working?
In our case, some of them, they're working, some not. Some still need a lot of work.
Okay.
So it's between.
I get that. I hear that sometimes as well. Some are doing well, and it depends on who the chair is and how the chair is leading, and some not so much because the chair isn't leading so well. So what about the rest of you?
I'm kind of in the same boat as Patricia. Some
Okay.
work, some don't.
Yep. Something to look at then. So just a note about board meetings overall. Well-structured and planned meetings are essential to getting the most from your board. So how you plan those board meetings, and I like to talk to people about consent agendas, but how you plan those meetings and what's on those agendas and how those committees are engaged with that board meeting really makes the difference about how, whether your board meetings are really effective, whether you're actually achieving what you need to. I make a general recommendation that your committees provide a written report that goes out with your board agenda and your board minutes and those kinds of things. and that they not actually report out everything that they're doing, but they decide if there's action items or other things that were on their report that they need to discuss with the board as a whole. So they're not reporting out everything that they did, like what color the napkins and the tablecloths are for the upcoming event, because the whole board, that's not really, they can read that on a report, but they can discuss important things at those board meetings. So they are engaging board meetings, and the board's really making important decisions. And then, let's see, I think I covered all those. Oh, consent agenda. Anybody work with a consent agenda?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Consent agenda is great to work with because it saves you tons of time at your board meetings, and gives you the opportunity to, again, discuss those things that are really important, because the board members can actually read those written committee reports, and they should be reading those written committee reports as well, so they understand what that committee is doing. And so if they have particular questions about those committee reports, that can be brought up in the board meeting to have that discussion. Basically, you should reserve board meeting time for discussion of those critical issues, concerns, and decision making. That's what board meetings should be about, as well as discussing things that are strategic or that are on your strategic plan, or discussing how you're making progress on achieving certain goals for the organization. That's the things that you really should be spending your board meeting time talking about. So that's all I have, but we have time for questions or comments. Certainly I will send these slides out to you. I can certainly, if you're interested in having the governance committee calendar, I could certainly send you that sample out as well. What questions or comments or thoughts do you all have about committees and committee structures, or your own committee structures, or anything else? Anything? Nope. Patricia?
In our case, as Salvation Army, so in general, they have many things and many details and all that one, but in Salina, we are working with all those details and some stuff that are according to our reality here. So yeah, it's like that. But we have a lot of information, kind of, that you were talking about, like about the governance committee. I was like, oh yeah, but we have with the other name, something like that, no? So
Yes.
kind of like relating.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It may not be by exactly that name. And it's kind of like, sometimes the development committee is called a fundraising committee instead.
Mhm.
And sometimes, sometimes organizations have an event committee, or sometimes that event, they just do those events under the fundraising committee. So there's variables in all committee structures. I think the important thing is that organizations identify what structure they need to have, what most suits their organization. I know here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, we have a programming committee, because we, of course, offer lots and lots of programming. So we get input from our board members and have them help connect us with speakers and topics and those types of things. So that's outside of that normal structure, but for that's really important. And we have a membership committee, but they focus on how do we grow our membership here at the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber. So it really is, varies. And I'm certain that Janelle, with the internal committee structure that they have with employees, that's all based on, what they need to have. I worked at Butler Community College for 12 years, and we had an organization within Butler that was for administrative staff. And certainly we had lots of different committees that were different than this committee structure. So yeah, it really just varies. Well, if you don't have any other questions or comments, I certainly appreciate you taking the time to participate today. It was such a pleasure to meet everyone. And I will send you out the slides, and you certainly let me know if there's anything else that we can help you with, or other questions that you that I can answer. If you need any other tools or anything else related to committees, we certainly have lots of those here as well. So with that, I'll wish you all a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you so much for your time.
You
Thank
bet.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.